The Biz-eWerk podcast is on the air, broadcasting from our Liberty Street studio at the College of Charleston School of Business. Today, with me via Zoom, is Al Churella, professor of history at Kennesaw State University and the author of a 3-volume series on the history of the Pennsylvania Railroad. Al, welcome to the Biz-eWerk podcast.
Well, thank you, Corey, and thanks so much for the opportunity to talk to you and your listeners today.
I want to get started with a little background about you. You've recently completed a 3-volume history of the Pennsylvania Railroad. It's more than 2,500 pages. I've got volume 1 right here just to give some perspective on the scope of the work, covering the history of the Pennsylvania Railroad from 1846 to the bitter end in 1968. Where did your interest in transportation history begin, and specifically what got you interested in wanting to research the Pennsylvania Railroad?
I suppose we go all the way back to the very beginning. I'm a firm believer that parents should expose their children to as many different things and opportunities as possible because you never know what's going to take root. And when I was a very young child, we lived maybe half a block away from a Pennsylvania Railroad branch line. So I would always hear the train, even in dinner time, and want to run out and see the train. My parents were very indulgent, and it happened to be, I think, coincidentally, a Pennsylvania Railroad branch line. At least it was for the first 4 years of my life. And then in 1968, it became part of Penn Central, and it's completely gone now. But that probably germinated something that gave me a lifelong love for trains. And so I'm a historian of the railroad industry and more broadly transportation policy, but I also have a passion for trains as objects, as artifacts, as part of American life, model railroading as well. And that's what led me when I was in college. So often we turn our dissertations into our first book. So, and I was in graduate school, I wrote a dissertation on the American railway locomotive industry and the transition from steam locomotives to diesel, which is just fascinating for all sorts of reasons. And it was, I think, based on the strength of that, that I never set out to write a history of the Pennsylvania Railroad. It wasn't kind of on my radar, but I was contacted by a good friend and colleague of mine, Mark Rose at Florida Atlantic University, who was co-editing a series at the University of Pennsylvania Press. And it was logical that Penn Press would want to have something done about the Pennsylvania Railroad. After all, the PRR was headquartered in Philadelphia and so on. And so Mark said, "Would you like to write a book about the Pennsylvania Railroad?" And I said, "Well, sure, why not? I don't have anything else to do right now." And so the project came to me, and I worked the arrangements out with the people at Penn Press for, get this, a 1-volume, 200,000 word. And for people who are in academic publishing, you'll know that 200,000 words is actually a fairly generous sort of allotment for a book. It's usually more like 130 or 140,000. And so that was to be finished in maybe 2 years-ish, something like that. And so I started researching and writing and telling people that I was writing this history of the Pennsylvania Railroad, and they kind of laughed. And it wasn't a good laugh. It was a laugh. It was sort of like the laugh you would get if you said that you were personally going to try to pay off the national debt yourself.
Right.
Maybe it can be done, but it's kind of unlikely. So after I'd written quite a bit, I went to my editor at Penn Press. I said, I'm already up to about 600,000 words and I'm not done yet. And he was very indulgent. And he said, "Well, we can publish a 2-volume history, but that's it, just two. It's 600,000 or so words apiece, which is obviously a lot more than 200,000 for the entire single book." And so I kept writing and writing and writing and came up with another 1.2 million words, went back to my editor and said, "Well, good news, bad news. The good news is I'm pretty much done with the manuscript. The bad news is it's twice as long as I thought it would be." But the silver lining to this cloud is that we can just make it a trilogy. And after all, I mean, we love trilogies, right? There's something sort
Absolutely.
of natural in literature and in life about having that 3-part series. And I did sort of structure it, sort of the birth and growth to maturity of the Pennsylvania Railroad, then this kind of complacent, secure middle age, and then the decline and death through merger. And so I thought it works well. And eh, for a variety of, I think, legitimate reasons, he declined to publish, which is why it's very unusual, I think, in academic publishing that the first volume came out with Penn Press and the second and third were brought out by Indiana University Press, which has a very fine
Mhm.
Railroads Past and Present series that's uh, very receptive to these kinds of history. So that's where it came from. It wasn't, again, something I set out to do. It was something that sort of came to me. And I guess I'm in a very fortunate position as a full professor, a senior academic, that I can pick and choose my projects and people sort of hand things off to me. And so that's how it came about. And it took, by the way, 21 years, not two or three, and it was maybe 1.6 million words, not 200,000.
Well, we've talked offline about a few things, trying to talk about what are some topics we can cover that align with business and history and railroading and the lessons that we could apply for today. And then you had mentioned you had written another book on the transition to from steam to diesel and how that was a change for Alco, American Locomotive, some other ones as they GE and GM kind of took over. I've always wondered what happened to all those pipe fitters and boilermakers that worked on steam locomotives. I mean, obviously wasn't too big to fail. Did they just find new work?
Um, One word, unemployed, about
Okay.
covers it. And some did, of course. But this story of the collapse of the three existing locomotive builders, and maybe I should go back and give a bit of background for people who aren't as
Sure.
familiar with the locomotive industry. That, of course, we all know about steam locomotives. From the earliest days of the railroads in the 1820s and 30s, there were steam locomotives.
Hmm.
And late 19th century, Rudolf Diesel develops his engine, the diesel engine, which he originally envisioned as a maritime sort of engine. But in the early to mid 20th century, it's adapted to railway locomotives. And particularly between about 1945 and 1955, diesels completely supplant steam locomotives in American railroads. They're much more efficient, much more reliable, and it's a very radical transformation in technology. If you think about the original airplanes, Wright brothers and so on, these are piston or propeller driven aircraft. And today, most of us fly in turbojet aircraft, but there's still plenty of propelled planes around in commercial aviation, recreational aviation. So it's not a complete turnover. But today, diesels are everywhere. Steam locomotives are museum pieces,
Right.
excursion, and so forth. And the question that I had, what fascinated me about the topic is why is it that three companies, American Locomotive, Baldwin Locomotive, and Lima Locomotive, that were superbly equipped to manufacture steam locomotives and had very good relationships with their customers, with the railroads, and did all three of them make diesels that worked, that functioned, they sold them, and so forth. So why did they fail? Not just a little bit, but completely fail to penetrate the industry, and why were two newcomers, a subsidiary of General Motors and later General Electric, that had no experience in locomotive design or construction at all? How do they completely supplant these long established builders? So that got me into the question of managerial failure or
Hmm.
the inability of managers to adapt to changing circumstances, and how it is that people who are extraordinarily good at their jobs and successful uh, all of a sudden can't cope with a different set of circumstances. They can't adapt, or at least not quickly enough to make a difference. And that was true, unfortunately, on a lower level with the pipe fitters and the boiler
Hmm.
makers and so on. And they lost their jobs not only at Alco and Lima and Baldwin, but what was even more notable is how many layoffs there were at the railroads, because of course they were the ones
Yeah.
who rebuilt and maintained and kept those steam locomotives running, and they had no jobs. They were replaced by individuals who understood about electrical equipment and so forth. And so it was especially for towns like Altoona, Pennsylvania, it was catastrophic. The town still hasn't recovered. And this is caught up in the larger story, of course, of deindustrialization, the Rust Belt, and so forth. So it wasn't as if these individuals could simply transition from, say, working at Alco to working at U.S. Steel, because U.S. Steel is having problems as well as are all these kind of heavy industrial companies.
This transition, and I run into a lot of people that don't really know a lot about railroads or even fully appreciate how integral they are to today's supply chain. That never really changed. We talked earlier about some of the technological changes that the railroads brought. I don't think most people fully appreciate how much technology was brought to the industrialized America by the railroads. What are some things that come to mind that were cutting edge, high technologies for the day that were brought to us by companies like the Pennsylvania Railroad?
Today, if you're a kind of a bright, ambitious young person and you want to get ahead and get a good salary and everything, you probably want to go work for the tech industry. You want to work with some aspect of computers, the internet, maybe biotechnology, something like that. But in the 19th century, it was the railroads. The railroads
Mm,
were the high-tech sector of the economy. That's where people went if they were drawn to and had a talent for things like civil engineering, electrical engineering, mechanical engineering, because among other things, you talk about the Pennsylvania Railroad, like other companies, it built, designed and built its own locomotives, steam locomotives. And these were, and even today, with one exception, which are the crawler tractors that NASA uses to move,
mm.
the Apollo craft around. With that one exception, steam locomotives are the largest, heaviest objects that move on land under their own power. They're amazingly complicated pieces of machinery. And only the best of the best could design and build something like that. And the same is true with signaling systems. If you think about how difficult it is to keep trains operating efficiently and safely, so that means the evolution in the 19th and the early 20th centuries of all kinds of signaling systems, automatic block signaling, then eventually centralized traffic control, where one person sitting in front of a console can direct traffic over hundreds of miles of track and dozens of trains and that kind of thing. And that is still true today when you think about positive train control, which was a congressional mandate for the railroads following the Chatsworth wreck in California. And the supporters of PTC often billed it at the time as an off-the-shelf technology, something that was easily implementable. And railroad officials knew better, and they poured resources, $10 billion more or less, into positive train control. And one executive told me a story. He said he was on a phone call with somebody from the Pentagon who said, "We're really interested in what you're doing with PTC because some elements of PTC are more complex than what we are able to accomplish. And so if you get this figured out, let us know. We could use some of your ideas." So even today, there's a very much a high tech element associated with railroading, and that's unchanged really, it's except in form from the way things were 150 or so years ago.
The Pensie's many times referred to as the standard railroad of the world. How does the development of the Pennsylvania Railroad manage how railroads developed into the huge industry, integral industry they were? Why were they the standard railroad?
Well, in some respects, that's kind of a misstatement that they're the standard
Hmm.
railroad of the world. That's what they said. That was one of
That
their
was their
advertising.
branding.
Well, that was their branding. That was their, and believe it or not, advertising slogans do not always reflect reality. So that's
I don't believe that.
um, but and tragically or sadly, I guess, in the 1950s they dropped that because they said we're so far out of touch with where we need
Hmm.
to be that we cannot adopt the high quality brand anymore because we're just not. Our standards have slipped
Yeah.
too far. But in a lot of respects, the Pennsylvania Railroad was not standard. A lot of their operating practices were atypical. Their locomotive designs were atypical. Some of their procedures were atypical. But I think it's a fitting description because so many people on other railroads, not just the United States, but in other countries, looked to the Pennsylvania Railroad. And there were delegations from European nations, from China, from Japan that would come and study the Pennsylvania Railroad. And because the Pennsylvania Railroad was sort of the cutting edge standard setter for railways worldwide. I mean, today we often look, for example, at the TGV in France or the Shinkansen in Japan and say, why can't we duplicate that? Well, 130 or 40 years ago, it was people from Japan or people from France coming to the United States and saying, "Oh, look at what the Pennsylvania Railroad's done. Why can't we do that here? And let's try that." And think about how big Pennsylvania Railroad was. Um, 11,000 or so miles of track over 13 states in the District of Columbia. And there were other railroads that covered a larger geographic area, but it's not just the number of miles or the area, it's the intensity of the traffic, all that
Mhm.
coal traffic, the steel traffic, the general freight, the passengers, the commuter services, all of those trains running day and night across Pennsylvania, the Midwest, and everything. And to coordinate all that and to ensure that every employee, and at one time, the Pennsylvania Railroad had more than 250,000 employees, to make sure that every employee knows what his or her job is, how to do it safely and efficiently, how to contribute to be that one small portion of the overall system. And so the Pennsylvania Railroad is not only innovative in its technology, it's innovative in its managerial structure too. And we think about how companies today, what we often call the line and staff managerial structure,
Mhm.
which is very similar in a lot of respects to the US military or any military organization with your generals and your colonels and so on and different ranks, because military personnel understand that no general can be everywhere on the battlefield at once. They can't manage every single aspect of a military operation. And the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad understood that too. And the question became, how do you delegate authority to local managers? In the old days, the pre-railroad days, imagine a textile mill. It was
Mhm.
very easy for one manager to walk around that building or complex of buildings in an hour or two and keep an eye on everything, but thousands of miles of track, it's impossible. And so it's not only delegating that authority, but maintaining the balance between giving local managers the autonomy to do what they think is best under the circumstances, yet also requiring them to conform to a system-wide corporate policy. And one of the things that I think a lot of people misunderstand about the Pennsylvania Railroad and other railroads is that they think that there was a top-down management system, that there was a organization manual, which is where all the guidelines for how the
Mhm.
organization is structured, that it was written at the presidential level and then handed down to every executive who followed it without question. The reality is local executives often came up with innovative solutions, and then if they worked, they filtered their way back up through the organizational hierarchy, and people in the central office in Philadelphia paid attention and said, this person out here on the, Zanesville division or whatever, they have an interesting idea that seems to work better than what we do. So let's rewrite the organization manual and then disseminate it more broadly through the organization. And I think a lot of corporations work that way today. And that's a legacy again of not just the PRR, but of the railroad industry in general.
Stay tuned for part 2 of my interview with Al Churella on the Biz-eWerk podcast.